All right, Ling 341. I'm going to try to wrap up the rest of this lecture in my car for reasons which will remain unknown and are totally unplanned, but here we are. Anyways, I was talking about the importance of phonological patterns in learning how to transcribe English or any language that you might be dealing with. So I'm going to walk you through one particular pattern and maybe you'll be able to see what the pattern is after we look at a set of data for it. I do want to mention, though, if you go to the Linguistics 341 homepage and you click on handouts, you should be, okay, so yeah. If you go to this link, I don't have internet access here in my car in the middle of a parking lot, but these are from the dates from the previous semester. But the guidelines for narrow transcriptions it's a basic PDF handout that I normally hand out in class, but this is the digital form of it, and it tells you about some of these various patterns that you might expect to find. We've talked about a few of these already, like the flapping rule for the alveolar flap at the beginning of unstressed syllables in English. So here's another rule which is not across the board in all English dialects, but we find it in some varieties of English, and it's a prominent sort of feature of that distinguishes, kind of half of the English-speaking world from the other half. So this rule applies to the production of in some English dialects, and we'll look at it comparing Canadian English to English English, as I'm calling it here. So if we have a form like care in Canadian English, you probably pronounce that as care. In English English, it's more like care. This one is park versus park. Or read versus read. Those are the same in that particular case. Other versus other, or ride versus ride. Carrot versus carrot. Cart versus caught. Some of these, so all the forms in Canadian English have an R where it's written in the orthographic form. Kind of where you'd expect it to be, but in English English it doesn't always appear. So some of these, like read, we get the and in others like care, we do not get the And I don't know or how bad my English accent is sounding exactly at the moment, so I'm not going to force it. This does remind me, though, this particular example. I was like poking through my video files. There is a video I wanted to show you which is relevant to this and is just kind of fun anyways. And it makes it even more fun because it's that I'm sitting in my car, because this is about parked cars. So this is from a Super Bowl commercial from the last Super Bowl. This is like not even a year old. This is from like 8 months ago, which seems like forever ago now. Like a totally different world, but this is, I'll just let it speak for itself, I guess. And it's exhibiting kind of the same pattern that we saw in that data set.
Oh, look at this guy. Hey, Rachel, how are you?
Hey, good. How are you?
He's not getting that car in there.
No, sir.
Look at these two troublemakers.
Hey, Johnny, how are you?
Wicked car. Is that new?
Yeah, it's a Sonata. Let me pack it.
Oh, you're not fitting your car in there.
Chris, stop being a smarty pants, all right? Look who's got Smart Pack.
Smart pack?
Just hit the clicker. Car packs itself.
It's smart.
It's wicked smart. And I can pack it anywhere.
How about Dorchester?
Packed it.
Foxborough.
Packed it.
The Garden?
Packed it.
Saugus.
Packed it.
Swampscott?
Revere.
The Harbor?
Are you kidding me? I packed it and then unpacked it.
You unparked it?
Kid.
Game changer.
That Sonata ain't got no driver.
That's all right. He's got smart pack.
Hey, look him back there.
He's got Smart pack!
Hey, whoa, it's Big Poppy.
Wicked smart.
This is a ghost car.
A better way to park. Only available on the all-new Sonata with remote smart parking assist.
Sorry about that, your bigness.
Did you guys know he lived there? I had no idea.
Okay, so not to flood you with commercial advertising in this class, but it's just funny to watch that now because like John Krasinski got famous doing his Some Good News bit on the internet, and David Ortiz got the virus and survived, and it's but anyways, the important point is the linguistic part. So English English and Boston English do the same thing with respect to and maybe you figured out the pattern by now, maybe you haven't, but I'll walk you through the rules. So where does appear, where does it go away? In Boston English and English English, you wouldn't say it in pakika. What would happen instead is that is only going to surface as, the phoneme is only going to surface as when it precedes vowels, like in read or carrot. and it's going to surface as schwa when it appears at the end of a syllable or word, like in kea or other. And then lastly, will disappear altogether, but it will make a preceding vowel longer when it appears before a consonant in the same syllable. So this is what we get in pak and kat, so on and so forth, or I guess ka as well. So yeah, with care and other, so the and other is basically like a syllabic in Midwestern English. In some varieties, you might get a schwa right before the but otherwise that is going to turn into a schwa in both of these cases, and in this case it's going to disappear. The only place you get it is preceding vowels. That's where it consistently appears, and so that's why you call this sort of prevocalic R, and in this case you call it like non-prevocalic R to kind of capture the whole pattern in the most general terms possible. So also, because R is disappearing in certain contexts here in like English or Boston English, these are called non-rhotic accents. So is a rhotic segment in English. That's why when you speak a variety of English like Canadian English or Midwestern English or something like that, that's called a rhotic variety of English. And in the non-rhotic ones, R is going to disappear sometimes. In the rhotic ones, it is appearing across the board everywhere. Okay, the interesting thing is that the world of English is divided up between rhotic dialects and non-rhotic dialects. This is one of the most prominent features you kind of perceive when you're hearing people speak across this divide, is that, well, maybe they're dropping their R's, maybe they're not. Why does that happen? So the rhotic dialects, you might be able to see a pattern in this as well. It's kind of funny how this played out through history, but Canadian English is largely a rhotic dialect. In fact, I can't think of any specific Canadian variety of English that is non-rhotic, even though there is obviously a lot of British and English influence in Canadian culture. Generally speaking, American dialects of English will be rhotic. Also, Irish English and Scots English, so on and so forth, are rhotic as well. The non-rhotic dialects you find in England, in Australia, and New Zealand too. And then some areas of the American East Coast, including prominent cities like Boston and New York, and also traditionally some areas of the American South, though I think that's kind of disappearing by now. So the history supposedly is that when England went out and settled half the world, as we probably all know, including far-flung places like Australia and Canada and so on and so forth. And they started doing that, with Newfoundland way back when, like 500 years ago. But it really got going like 1600, 1700, so on and so forth. And so before about 1700, all of English was a rhotic dialect of English, so they would not drop their R's anywhere. And so any place that got settled by the English before 1700 is largely going to be a rhotic dialect, including places that were just straight up colonized, like Ireland and Scotland. And then, well, I guess all these places were straight up colonized, whatever the case may be. But anyways, the places that were colonized after 1700, like Australia, sound different because in about 1700 in London English, the Londoners decided it would just be cool to start dropping their R's for whatever reason. And so it started out sort of in the center of the English-speaking world, or the British Empire, whatever you want to call it. And then it spread from there. But it spread in a way that, number one, for Australia and New Zealand, they were settled after this change started to happen. So that's kind of the distinction between them and like Canada and the United States. And then also there are places like Boston and New York who are still kind of looking back to England as like the sort of their connection to the old world. And they also wanted to be kind of prestigious with respect to the rest of the United States, or America as it was called at the time, the colonies. And so they copied the London pattern of dropping their R's already 300 years ago. The rest of the world that got colonized by the British, like Ireland and Scotland, was like, we don't want to have anything to do with that, so we're just going to keep the R's where they are. Thank you very much. But that's kind of the history of how these like two parts of the world got split up, even though we speak the same language, more or less. So this is something I noticed. I just wanted to throw in here. This is some data I just found on the internet a few weeks ago about how this has kind of changed over time in England itself. So this is a dialect survey that was conducted in just England proper, showing you where people are dropping the R in a word like arm. So they either say arm if they keep the what's if they drop the R, right? In that particular context, it's just going to make that vowel long. And in 1950, the green areas are basically where people are dropping the R. And so London is down here and kind of has this influence up here in the northern and eastern parts of the country. And in this southwestern swatch, they are keeping the So not only is Scotland, which is up here, keeping the and Ireland keeping the over here, but also this part is a rhotic dialect. But by 2016, that had changed. So this influence is still, changing the English-speaking world as we speak. So throughout 66 years, basically the R full dialects or the rhotic dialects have basically disappeared from England proper. So this southwestern corner is known as Cornwall in England, and that has a tradition. Traditionally there was a Celtic language spoken there called Cornish, so it has some sort of cultural similarities, or at least traditionally has some cultural similarities to Wales, Ireland, and Scotland as well. So maybe there's slightly less influence there, but still most people there are speaking a non-rhotic variety of English at this point in time. So that's become a lot more prevalent throughout England over the past couple of generations, even moving way past 1700. I noticed just randomly, I knew about this fact, but it's kind of funny to see how this matches up with where the Vikings settled in England way back in the day. So if we go back to like 500, then all of England was basically settled by what were called the Anglo-Saxon people, who came primarily from mainland Europe, from what is now Germany. But in the next sort of couple centuries, the Vikings started invading England, and this is a map from 878, and they established a lot of settlements here in the northeastern part of the country in a portion of England which was called the Danelaw at that particular time. So the Danes were related to the Vikings, whatever. That's why it's called the Danelaw. So it's funny because there's this old kind of boundary between like the Viking part of England and the sort of Germanic part of England that actually corresponds fairly well to this divide between the rhotic and non-rhotic dialects or varieties of England back in 1950. That's been wiped away apparently for whatever reason. So this non-rhotic variety of English is still, prestigious enough to have influence in that way, but who knows, maybe there was still some influence through the centuries to maintain this distinction at this point in time in 1950. So I think that's all I'm going to say about that. I haven't established this scientifically, it's just kind of a funny observation that I noticed. The main point, though, is that when we look at the world of English, we have to keep in mind these rules for where particular phonemes are going to surface or not. I've also got another funny little example from slightly closer to home, from New York City. So this is from a website called Overheard in New York, which I got a long time ago. This last I checked, this website is still going. So this is basically people overhearing conversations like on the subway in New York or just in public, wherever, and then they submit them to this website because they think they're funny or representative of New York City in some, unique way. And this one I think is a pretty good little conversation. So this is starts off with an old lady with a heavy New York accent pointing to a closed door and says, "What's that?" And then a young lady says, "I'm not sure." And an old lady says, "Is that a pawn shop?" Young lady says, "No, that looks like a pawn shop." Old lady, "That's what I said, a pawn shop." Young lady, "Oh, I thought you said porn shop." Old lady says, "No, I said pawn, not porn." And young lady says, "Oh, you say them exactly the same." "I do?" "Yeah, say aw, or. Now say or. Or. No, it's or with an R. Oh, that's what I said, or." So, right, what's going on here, hopefully I transmitted it reasonably well, was that for the old lady, she's processing things at the phonemic level, right? So there are these non-rhotic dialects that have these rules where R gets eliminated when you actually say these particular words out loud, like porn or pawn, like park or whatever. But phonemically, that R is still there in the old lady's head, right? And it just gets dropped through sort of these phonological rules, and in the phonetic surface, we don't see the R anymore. So this old lady is going to hear, well, she's going to think that aw and or are different in her head, but the way she actually says them, there happens to be a merger, like aw and aw. Yeah, for the young lady, though, there's a phonetic difference and a phonemic difference, too. Just again, the point is, the world of meaning is how you like perceive the world of language around you, regardless of what is actually coming out of your mouth, which is not as meaningful, even though you still have to get that pattern right to fit in with the phonology of a particular variety of a language, like New York City or wherever, Boston, what have you. Okay, so with that in mind, it's going to be tricky for us to pay attention to this phonetic level of how R's get produced in English or any other variety of sound, but we still need to learn kind of where to expect the patterns, because that'll help us out in giving us a guide to know what to expect, basically. So rhotic dialects like Canadian English or American English vary in the number of vowel distinctions that can be made before I'll give you the system of English that I speak. You guys might speak this as well. It's likely that you speak a slightly different one. Either way, kind of judge for yourself based on what you know about the way you speak on your own. So for me, I have a 5-vowel system in this context, which is a vowel before basically in the coda of a syllable. So I have fear, cours, fair, for, and far. I got 5 different vowels there, and then there's another slightly different context where the vowels appear before R, but then there's another vowel after the R, so they're not in the same syllable in these guys. So I've got weary, wary, lorry, and sorry. So the kind of crucial part here is that without this R being in the coda of the same syllable as the vowels in question, these kind of wind up being open syllables. So in theory, they could maybe do, have the freedom to do more things than if they're constrained by a coda consonant. But overall, the general pattern is that I have 5 vowels in this context and 4 vowels in this context, or 4 vowel contrasts in this context and 5 vowel contrasts here. What I don't have is the complete set of vowel distinctions that we normally expect to see or hear in English. So in fear, I don't really have a distinction between E and I. I don't have fear and fear or something like that. I just say fear. And, maybe it's somewhere in between these 2 vowels. I kind of prefer transcribing it with an E there, even though it doesn't sound quite exactly the way a regular ear E does in English. Same thing for cours. So I have an oo and an or I don't have a distinction between these 2. I just have an oo, which maybe is shading a little towards because it doesn't really matter if there's no distinction. There's no a contrast for me. I just have fair. I normally transcribe that with this guy. Actually, I probably will highlight these guys if I can, just so you know how I transcribe them and how you can feel free to transcribe them for yourself as well. So you get these guys. The high ones are the tense variants, and then the mid ones are the lax variants, so and o. For, I talked about that one a while back. The best way to kind of understand how to pronounce or perceive an open O is to say a word like for, and then just not say the at the end, because this vowel in the middle is probably open O for you. And then there's no such distinction like an distinction for far. For me, it's R. It's this one in the back. There's also in my variety of English no schwa or upsilon. So if I do say a word like fur, I don't have a schwa like this in there. I just have a syllabic It's not fur or something like that. Just fur. So there's limitations. Basically, the presence of the this particular context, means that I'm not going to have as many phonological contrasts between the vowels that appear right before it. And it's a funny little trick. There are phonetic reasons why this is the case, but basically you have to keep in mind that context is going to affect the phonetics here. That's the main point. And it may affect your phonetics slightly differently than it affects mine. So I'll walk through this again and then talk about vowel system or English vowel system number 2, where for a large to a great extent. It's the same, especially weary, wary, lorry, and sorry. But there's a collapsed contrast or a merged contrast here in the upper right-hand corner of the space. So there's no distinction for these speakers between for and cours. Instead, they say for and cours. It's exactly the same. Yeah. So there's no distinction between oo, o, and open O in that particular case. And you can kind of interpret that as there being only 4 vowel phonemes. I've got these guys transcribed as A and O here. You could also transcribe them or use the symbols open O and epsilon for that one because it doesn't really matter. It's just a question of how close to the phonetics you want to get. Give me a second here to get a brief drink. Yeah, so my guess is that you guys might have vowel system number 3. That's the one I hear most often in Canadian English. So there's a 5 vowel contrast, or 5 phoneme contrast, contrastive system over here in the preceding R in the same syllable context. So we have fear, fair, far, for, and cours. But most Canadians, or a lot of Canadians, will collapse this contrast between lorry and sorry. So weary, wary, lorry, and then sorry for most Canadians. And then it's always an open question to me whether you in particular say how you say this particular vowel in a word like tomorrow. Do you say tomorrow or do you say tomorrow? For me, it's tomorrow. For you, it might be tomorrow. And I've encountered a few people who will say sorry, but then say tomorrow in Canadian English. If you're being consistent across the board with this, then tomorrow it'd be lorry, sorry, and tomorrow, so on and so forth. There's also, not to get too far afield here, but there's this kind of traditional garment from Indian culture, this guy. So it's an open question as to whether you say these two the same, sorry and sorry. Yeah, you can let me know. But if you just don't have this R-E, sorry, tomorrow, sorry, so on and so forth. If you don't have that at all, then you have this system, which is 3 vowel contrasts over here. And I've also encountered a couple of speakers who have this system. I think both of them have been from Newfoundland. So they collapse this vowel pairing, the weary and wary, contrast into weary and weary. So even if it's spelled like this, it's weary as well. Yeah, so that might be you as well. So that one only has basically 2 vowels that can appear in the vowel R vowel context, which is kind of fun. So we're losing contrast here just in this particular context. But there's also other vowel systems that have more contrast in that than my system does. So this system has still the same 5 vowels over here: fear, fair, far, for, and cours. And then over here, it has a lot of different distinctions in the vowel R vowel context. So weary, merry, marry, lurid, lorry, murray, and sorry. So yeah, there's lots going on here. Whoops, let's go back. The main one that draws a lot of attention for a lot of people is this 3-way distinction between marry, marry, and marry. And hopefully I did that well enough, not being a native speaker of this variety. My mom is, and after moving to the Midwest, she's gotten very frustrated that people like me and my father, say these all the same: marry, marry, marry. What the heck? We don't get confused. But then it also has lurid, so it has an actual oo here, contrasting with the open O, lorry, and then also this is a wedge, murray, and this is an ah. So there's 8 different possible vowels in this particular system. Yeah, so I guess I'll go back and just kind of, to make the point clear, going back to this sort of diagram of the various vowels that we can get in American English. These are the basic vowel phonemes with maybe a few extra options thrown in. I want to try to insert a drawing here. Am I going to get away with this? I should have looked at how to do this. Yes, here we go, lines. So basically, the idea is we're kind of in this pre-R context, kind of splitting up our vowel system into different regions in which there is no contrast, basically. Maybe I'll make this red so you can see it a little bit better. And I'll also make this dashed as well. Yeah, so yeah, that'll work. Now I'm just going to copy. So E and I, there's no contrast between those two guys. And I'll kind of cordon this off here. So that's off in its own space and there's no contrast there. And then over here in the upper right hand corner of the space, there's no contrast between U and so on and so forth. Hopefully I can get away with this. There's no contrast here between A and E. So yeah, the whole system is going to be reduced. And I think I need to, yeah, that's good enough. So I've got kind of a 5 vowel system here. There's nothing in the middle again, but there's one vowel here, there's one vowel here, there's one vowel here, there's one vowel here, and then there's one vowel for the bottom as well. And like I said, the way my system kind of works out phonetically is I get this particular guy for fear, this one for cours, this one for fair, and this one for for, and then this one for far. But there's no distinction. I would never make a distinction between like far and far. Since I said far or far, that is another sort of Canadian variant you can sometimes get, is that in Eastern Canada, in the Atlantic provinces like Nova Scotia, they will front this in that particular context and say far as opposed to far, like that. Okay, so now you know. And I normally write this on the board, so I apologize for kind of the awkwardness of this. There's no chalkboard or whiteboard in my car, if you can believe it, but we'll just have to make do. I'm going to tell you one more aspect of Canadian raising, and then I think I'm going to call it a day on the car lecture. But another characteristic of Canadian English is what's called the raising of the first part of the diphthongs I and ow. So in both cases, what happens here is the part of these diphthongs, the first half of it, gets raised to a schwa, and it's called raising because we're going from a low vowel like to a mid vowel schwa. So I goes to I, and ow goes to o. And to an American ear, whenever I hear anybody do this in Canada, I can immediately pin them down as, well, you're Canadian. And of course, most people around here are Canadian, but when you hear them elsewhere, like in the United States, then it really jumps out. I'm going to mention here, I'm going to show you some data about where this appears in Canadian English, but I will say, first of all, that historically, if we again go back hundreds of years in the English-speaking world, all the varieties of English did this. This part of the diphthong would go up to for I and o in particular contexts, and then the other varieties of English just stopped doing it. So it's a little bit funny to say that Canadian English is the one that does this. It's sort of the one variety that still does this, and everybody else changed. Maybe you've had experiences like that in your life. I don't know, life. Anyways, this only happens in certain sound environments like life or like. It happens in out. It happens, but it doesn't happen in loud. It happens in rice. I do it in this environment too. It does not happen in ride. It happens in pipe. It does not happen in bribe. I think I said like and life, so on and so forth. It does not happen in live, so on and so forth. Yeah, there's like, and then rise, it does not happen there. So maybe you guys can let me know why this is happening. So we're getting the raising over here in these one-syllable forms. We're not getting the raising over here in these one-syllable forms. What's the difference between the two? I'm going to let you think about that, but I'm also going to give you some examples because often, because this is an allophonic change, this can be hard for a lot of Canadian listeners to hear. So I've got some examples of where it does and does not happen. These are some recordings from me and a few of my former students, in particular one, John Delamont, who was nice enough to offer his services for this purpose. And here's John saying the word house.
House.
The way I do not say it. So here's him.
House.
And here's me.
House.
And here's just that diphthong in the middle.
Out. Out.
Maybe you can hear that.
House. House.
I say house, he says house. Okay, sorry for yet another venue change, but I got interrupted in the middle of that last slide, so we're going to try to wrap it up here in the basement. Anyways, to start off with, I want to go back to these first two examples, both the Canadian and the American versions thereof, so you can kind of just focus on the difference between the way the Canadian diphthong sounds and the American diphthong sounds. So here's John's production of this word for the place in which you live, like a basement.
House.
And then here's my version of the same word.
House.
And hopefully you can hear that, but we'll focus again on the diphthong part of it
Out.
versus
Out.
So again, the first part of my diphthong there is a bit lower than John's, which is more like a schwa. But in this word, for what, I don't know, a coyote does,
Howl. Howl.
those two should sound more or less the same. And the diphthongs of both of those
Out. Out.
are basically the same. But when you play my two diphthongs,
Out. Out.
that's basically the same, slightly different pitch, but John's sound different.
Out. Out.
And the reason I'm kind of focusing in on this is because if you're a Canadian speaker of English, these are just kind of allophonic variants of the same phoneme of a diphthong. So you may be processing them at the phoneme level and hearing that phoneme as like the same, even though if you listen really closely at the phonetic level, you should be able to hear a difference.
Out.
But it's not easy
Out.
if you're not used to thinking of them as different. We can also look at the diphthongs in these two words, the Canadian and
Bike.
American versions.
Bike. Bike.
And in this case, I actually pronounce the diphthongs differently in these two words.
Bile. Bile.
So John and I will sound the same across the two, but we're both pronouncing them phonetically differently.
Bike. 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 Bike.
Yeah, so hopefully you can hear there's a bit of raising in both of these.
Bike. Bike. Bike.
For bike. Yeah, so I have this little note here about how fun it is to switch John's vowels in these two words. We can try it for both sets and then see what happens. But I'll show you how to do that. So here's in Prot, this word bike.
Bike. Bike.
And what we can do here is open up bile.
Bile.
And just grab the I part of this, which is about from here to here.
Bot. Bot. L. L. L.
And then there's maybe like an L,
L. L. L.
something like that. So I'm just going to grab, I think, this part.
Bot. 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 Bot.
And then copy it over to the clipboard. And then put it where the I part of Ike is supposed to be.
Bike. Bike. Bike.
So I'm going to cut out that, the original. And what are we left with?
Bot. Bot. Bot.
So yeah, it's like back. Not getting too much of the I. I guess I could include a bit more of that in here, perhaps. Yeah, and if you do it just right, it'll sound a lot like a Southern accent.
Bike. Bike.
I've got the timing a little bit off. But you can hear, I think there's definitely a difference between that and bike.
Bike.
Bike. Let's try it again with house and howl.
House.
So here's the first part of John's house. That's more of a schwa, and this is the part of it. More or less. Let's grab the ow from howl and see if it or how it sounds different to our ears.
Howl.
Let's grab about this.
Howl. Howl. Howl.
So that sounds like ow, right? And we'll put it right about here. And we'll eliminate the original as best we can.
House. House. House.
Yeah. That sounds okay to me. I don't know how it sounds to you.
House.
It's a little funny with the clipping, but of the editing, but
House.
it should sound different from that.
House. House.
Yeah, not quite as Canadian, I guess you would say. So yeah, I'm going on about how this is Canadian raising, and we still haven't talked about the reasons why this occurs, but not every Canadian does this. It's just kind of a unique feature of Canadian English. So here's another student from Calgary from a long time ago.
House.
Who does not do the Canadian raising
Howl.
in either case.
House.
So that should sound a bit more like my.
House.
So it varies. It depends on the individual. I've also got this subtle distinction here between the different low back vowels. So my low back vowel, ah,
Hot.
in hot,
Hot.
is not that rounded.
hot,
But my former student Aaron did round it a little bit. So this one's really close.
hot, hot,
But if you listen to it long enough, you will be able to perceive the difference. That's the distinction between these two guys. Just in the hot context. All right, so next time we'll talk about why this occurs a little bit. And sorry about the confusion for this particular lecture video. It's a little tricky to make this happen in the midst of pandemic times. But also, we'll talk about the dimensions of consonant articulation, which are actually what feed into this pattern that we get in Canadian raising and the various sort of allophonic changes we see in a lot of different vowel articulations. So still a long way to go before we have complete understanding, but we'll get there soon enough. We'll just see where I am when it happens. See you next time.